50 luxury cabins, $30 million, all built on land I've owned since my father bought it in 1978. And I didn't say a word. I watched them clear my trees. I watched them pour the foundations. I watched them frame the walls, install the hot tubs, and photograph the mountain views from porches they had no right to build. I watched the brochures go out, the purchase agreements get signed, and 50 families pack their moving trucks. And I stayed quiet, because my attorney told me something I'll never forget.
If you stop them now, you get your land back. If you wait until the champagne is poured and the pens are on the table, you get everything.
So I waited. 9 months. And on the morning of the grand closing weekend, I filed 50 list pendants and shut down every single sale. If you want to know how one man took back $30 million from an HOA that thought it owns his forest, stay right here. Tell me below, where are you watching from? My name is Colton Mercer, and I own 240 acres of mountain forest in Rabun County, Georgia. My father, Thomas Mercer, bought that land in 1978 when it was nothing but second-growth timber and creek beds full of smooth river stone. He spent 30 years walking every ridge, marking every boundary, planting seedlings where the old loggers had stripped the hillsides bare. By the time I was old enough to carry a compass, he had me reading contour maps and pounding stakes alongside him every summer. When he passed in 2014, he left the whole parcel to me, along with a deed so clean the county recorder's office used it as a filing example. I spent 22 years as a surveyor with the Army Corps of Engineers. I've mapped floodplains in Louisiana, drawn boundary lines along the Tennessee River, and staked elevation points in places most people couldn't find on a map. I know land the way a mechanic knows engines, by feel, by sound, by the way things sit when they're right, and the way they shift when something's wrong. 3 years ago, my wife Ellie lost her fight with pancreatic cancer. She was 51. The forest was our place. Every Sunday morning we'd walk the ridge trail she'd named Hummingbird Loop, because in June, the ruby-throated hummingbirds would hover around the trumpet vine she planted along the first quarter mile. After she died, I stopped walking that trail. I couldn't hear the birds without hearing her voice underneath them. The smell of warm pine needles in the afternoon still catches me off guard sometimes. That was her smell, sunlight and resin, and the faint sweetness of wildflowers she'd tucked behind her ear. I moved into the small cabin on the north edge of the property and kept to myself, cooked on a cast-iron skillet my father gave me, read paperbacks on the porch until the light dropped behind the ridge. I wasn't hiding from anything. I just didn't have much left to say to anyone. The trouble started on a Tuesday in April. I was clearing deadfall near the south boundary when the axe stopped mid-swing in my hands. Fresh stumps. Not storm damage, clean cuts, chainsaw cuts, on trees I hadn't touched. The sawdust was still pale and wet, and the smell of fresh-cut oak hung in the air like a warning. Orange survey flags tied to aluminum stakes ran in a straight line through timber my father had planted 40 years ago. I followed those flags for a quarter mile. They didn't follow my property line. They ran 1,200 feet east of it, right through the heart of my forest. I drove down to the Mountain Laurel Estates HOA office that afternoon. Mountain Laurel was the gated community that bordered my land to the west. 300 homes, a clubhouse with a copper roof, and a stone entrance sign that cost more than most people's cars. The woman behind the front desk was Shelby Whitmore, HOA president, 9 years running. Blonde, heavy-set, wearing a white blazer over yoga pants, with gold-rimmed sunglasses pushed up on her head like a tiara. The kind of woman who mistakes volume for authority and a clipboard for a badge. I told her someone had been cutting trees and placing survey flags on my property. She looked at me the way you'd look at a stain on a restaurant tablecloth, irritated, like I was ruining the aesthetic. "Mr. Mercer," she said, leaning back in her leather chair with her fingers laced across her stomach. "That land has been part of our development plan for 2 years, sweetheart. You might want to double-check your little paperwork before you come in here making accusations." She smiled when she said it. Not a friendly smile, the kind that says, "I've already won, and you don't know it yet." I walked out of that office without another word. But I didn't go home angry. I went home curious. And for a man who spent 22 years drawing lines for a living, curiosity is a far more dangerous thing than then anger. The next morning, I drove back to the south boundary before sunrise. The fog was still clinging to the hollows, thick as cotton, and the gravel crunched under my boots as I stepped off the truck and listened. What I found was worse than survey flags. A road had been bulldozed through the timber, gravel over scraped red clay, wide enough for dump trucks and excavators. The topsoil was gone. The root systems of old-growth oaks were exposed and dying, torn up like stitches ripped from a wound. Fresh tire tracks from heavy equipment ran in both directions, and I could hear diesel engines idling somewhere deeper in the trees, their low rumble vibrating through the morning air. I followed that road on foot for about half a mile, until I reached a clearing that shouldn't have existed. 8 men in hard hats were grading a flat building pad in a space where, 3 months earlier, there had been nothing but 60-year-old white oaks and thick underbrush. A foreman in a yellow safety vest stood near a mud-splattered pickup truck, checking a clipboard and drinking coffee from a thermos. The smell of turned earth and diesel exhaust hung in the clearing like a fog of its own. I walked up and introduced myself, told him my name, told him I owned the land he was standing on. He set his coffee down slowly and looked at me the way you'd look at someone who just told you the sky was green. He flipped through his paperwork and turned the clipboard toward me. The permits were issued to Mountain Laurel Development, LLC. The project was listed as Mountain Laurel Forest Retreats, Phase 1, Lots 1 through 50. 50 cabins. On my forest. The address on the permits traced right back to Shelby Whitmore's HOA office. "Sir," the foreman said, adjusting his hard hat, "according to everything I've got right here, this land belongs to the developer. If you've got a dispute, you need to take it up with them. We're just doing what we were hired to do." I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice. I just nodded, walked back to my truck, and drove straight to the Rabun County Recorder's office. The clerk behind the counter was a young woman named Paige, who'd been working there about 2 years. I asked to see the current recorded survey for Parcel 47B, my parcel. She pulled it up on the screen and turned the monitor toward me. What I saw made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The survey on file was not the one my father recorded in 1978. It was a brand new document, filed 14 months earlier by a licensed surveyor named Dale Kessler, contracted by Mountain Laurel Development, LLC. The boundary line on this new survey had been shifted 1,200 feet to the east, carving exactly 80 acres of prime hardwood forest off my property, and folding them into the developer's parcel like they had always been theirs. I stared at that screen for a long time. In 22 years of drawing property lines for the United States Army, I had never seen anything this deliberate. This wasn't a clerical error. This wasn't a disputed overlap. Someone had sat down, redrawn my boundary, and filed it with the county as fact. Was there any notification sent to the adjacent property owner when this survey was recorded? I asked Paige. She scrolled through the attached documents and shook her head. No notification on file, but there is a supporting letter attached from the Mountain Laurel Estates HOA board, confirming the boundary adjustment is consistent with their development plan. A letter from the HOA board, Shelby Whitmore's board, confirming a boundary change on land they had never owned. Now here's something most people don't realize. In the state of Georgia, knowingly filing a fraudulent document with a county recorder is a felony under OCGA Section 16-1020. It carries up to 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. And when that document is a property survey used to steal someone's land, the charge escalates to deed fraud, the kind of offense that doesn't get settled with a handshake and a good attorney. I thanked Paige, walked back to my truck, and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes, with the engine running and the windows down. The late morning sun was baking the asphalt, and heat shimmered off the hood in long, lazy waves. I could feel my pulse thumping in my temples, steady and slow. But I wasn't angry, I was calculating. Because at that moment, I understood something clearly. This wasn't a neighbor accidentally crossing a fence line. This wasn't an HOA board getting aggressive about someone's landscaping. This was organized, premeditated land theft. And the people behind it had looked at me, a quiet widower living alone in a cabin, and decided I was too small to notice and too weak to fight. They had no idea what kind of man they'd just made an enemy of. Over the next 3 weeks, I watched the construction accelerate. Every morning, More trucks rumbled down the road they'd cut through my forest. Every evening, I'd walk the perimeter and count the new concrete pads. By the end of April, 12 foundations had been poured. By mid-May, the framing crews arrived. The sound of nail guns echoed through the trees from dawn until dusk, sharp and rhythmic, like a woodpecker made of steel. I kept notes, dates, times, license plates, equipment serial numbers. I photographed everything with a digital camera I bought at the hardware store in Clayton. I wasn't building a scrapbook. I was building a case. The first week of June, I drove to Gainesville and sat down with a real estate litigation attorney named Ray Combs. Ray was 63, bald, built like a mailbox, and had spent 30 years handling land disputes in Northeast Georgia. He looked at my father's deed, the original 1978 survey, and the fraudulent 2022 filing. Then he leaned back, took off his glasses, and said something I will never forget. "Colton, you've got one of the cleanest title chains I've ever seen. Your father's deed is airtight. The survey they filed is fraudulent on its face. Any competent surveyor would spot the discrepancy in 10 minutes. He paused. "But here's the thing. If you stop the construction now, you'll get an injunction. A judge will halt the project, and eventually you'll get your land back. But that's all you'll get. The developer will tear down whatever they've built, walk away, and probably settle for $50,000 in damages." He leaned forward. "But if you wait, if you let them finish building, let them market those cabins, let buyers sign purchase agreements, and let the closings get scheduled, then we file on all 50 lots at once. List pendants on every single parcel. The title clouds, the closings collapse. And under Georgia law, any permanent improvement built on your land without your consent becomes your property. You won't just get your forest back, you'll own every cabin sitting on it." I sat with that for a long minute. The air conditioning hummed. Outside the window, a mockingbird was going through its whole repertoire on a power line. "How long do I need to wait?" I asked. "Until the champagne is poured and the pens are on the table," Ray said. "That's when it hurts the most." So I went home and I waited. I kept my mouth shut. I kept my head down. And I let them build. Meanwhile, Shelby Whitmore was making sure I knew my place. The first notice arrived in my mailbox the second week of June. A formal HOA courtesy warning about excessive noise from my property. The noise in question was my generator, which I'd been running for 11 years without a single complaint. The second notice came 4 days later, a code enforcement citation for an unauthorized structure on my land. The structure was my tool shed, the one my father built in 1982. I drove to the county building department and asked about the citation. The clerk pulled it up and frowned. "This was called in by the HOA office. But, Mr. Mercer, your property isn't in their jurisdiction. You're not part of Mountain Laurel Estates." "I know," I said. "I just wanted that on the record." The third notice was the most creative. Shelby filed a complaint with the county health department, claiming my septic system was contaminating groundwater near the new development. An inspector came out, tested everything, and found nothing. He told me it was the third time in 2 years someone from that HOA had filed a false environmental complaint against a neighboring property owner. "Third time?" I said. He nodded. There were 2 other landowners on parcels adjacent to that development. Both sold their land within a year of the complaint starting. One told me he just couldn't take the harassment anymore. That hit me harder than any legal document. 3 families, 3 parcels. The same playbook every time. File false complaints, create pressure, force a sale, absorb the land. Shelby Whitmore hadn't just stolen my forest. She'd done this before. She'd perfected it. I thanked the inspector, closed the door, and sat down at my kitchen table. Through the window, I could see the tree line where my property met the construction zone. The late afternoon light was turning the oak canopy gold, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the grinding of an excavator chewing through another ridge. The smell of diesel drifted through the screen door, mixing with the pine resin from the trees closest to the cabin. It smelled like a forest being eaten alive. I picked up my phone and called Ray Combs. "How many foundations have they poured now?" he asked. 12, I said. "Good," he said. "Let them pour 50. By September, 35 cabins had been framed, roofed, and sided. The construction site that had started as a gravel road through the trees now looked like a small village. Cedar-clad A-frames with stone chimneys, wrap-around porches, and hot tubs sitting on freshly stained decks. They were beautiful, if you didn't know they were stolen. The marketing had started in August. I found the first brochure tucked into my own mailbox, a glossy trifold titled Mountain Laurel Forest Retreats. Your escape starts here. I opened it and felt something twist in my chest. The cover photo was an aerial drone shot of the North Ridge, my North Ridge, with the morning fog rolling through the hardwoods, exactly the way Ellie used to describe it in her journal. Like the mountains are breathing, she'd written once. They'd turned my grief into a sales pitch. The brochure listed prices ranging from $450,000 to $850,000 per cabin. 50 units. Total projected revenue, just over $30 million. The developer was listed as Mountain Laurel Development LLC, with an office address at the HOA clubhouse. I started seeing ads online, social media posts. A drone video set to acoustic guitar music showing families roasting marshmallows on a cabin porch, while the sunset turned the ridgeline amber. The tagline read, "Built by nature, perfected by Mountain Laurel." Built by nature, on my land, with my trees cut down to make room. In October, Shelby held a community information meeting at the Mountain Laurel Clubhouse. The invitation went out to every homeowner in the subdivision, but my neighbor Hank Pryor, a retired high school history teacher who lived on 10 acres east of me, slipped me a copy. Hank was 71, sharp as a tack, and one of the few people in the area who didn't owe Shelby Whitmore a favor. "You should see this," Hank said, handing me the flyer on my porch. "She's doing a victory lap." I went to the meeting. Sat in the back row wearing a flannel shirt and work boots, looking like exactly the kind of man Shelby Whitmore would ignore. The clubhouse was packed, about 120 residents, folding chairs lined up under fluorescent lights that hummed like a wasp nest. Shelby stood at the front in a cream-colored blazer with pearl earrings, a projection screen behind her showing renderings of the completed cabin community. She spoke for 20 minutes about the development, how it would revitalize the area, bring high-quality tourism, and increase existing property values by an estimated 40%. Then she said something that made my jaw tighten. "Some people in this county," she said, glancing briefly toward the back of the room, "would rather let perfectly good land sit and rot than see any kind of progress. But progress doesn't wait for anyone, and this community has never been about standing still." A few heads turned toward me. I kept my face blank. She clicked to the next slide, a list of the development team. And that's when I saw it. The developer of record was Garrett Whitmore, president of Mountain Laurel Development LLC. Same last name, same address listed on the permits, same woman standing at the podium. Shelby Whitmore's husband was the developer. The HOA president had used her position to approve a $30 million development on stolen land, and the developer building it was her own husband. She'd signed off on boundary changes, suppressed complaints, and harassed adjacent landowners into selling, all so her family could pocket the profits. Now here's what makes that not just unethical, but legally explosive. In Georgia, an HOA board member has what's called a fiduciary duty to the homeowners they represent. That means they're legally obligated to act in the community's best interest, not their own. When an HOA president approves a development that directly benefits her spouse's company, without disclosure, without a recusal, without a vote, that's a breach of fiduciary duty. And in a case involving $30 million of real estate built on fraudulently acquired land, that breach turns into a conspiracy charge faster than you can spell subpoena. I sat through the rest of the meeting without saying a word. When it was over, I walked to my truck in the dark, the gravel crunching under my boots, the October air cold enough to see my breath. The ridgeline was a black silhouette against a sky full of stars, and somewhere out there, my forest was being carved into lots and sold to strangers who had no idea what they were buying. I pulled out of the parking lot and called Ray Combs from the road. "They're married," I said. Ray was quiet for 3 seconds. "Well," he said, "that changes everything." The following week, I drove to the Rabun County Archives, a squat brick building behind the courthouse that smelled like old paper and floor wax. I told the archivist I needed the original plat map for parcel 47B, Township 3 North, Range 2 East, recorded in 1978. She brought out a large manila envelope, sealed with a red string clasp. Inside was the original survey plat, hand-drawn on heavy linen paper, with ink lines faded to a warm brown, but still perfectly legible. My father's name was printed in the cartouche at the bottom. Thomas W. Mercer, owner of record, parcel 47B, 240 acres, recorded April 12, 1978. Below his name was the surveyor's certification, signed by a licensed professional named Gerald Dunham, who'd been dead for 15 years. I laid the 1978 plat flat on the reading table and set the 2022 survey beside it. Then I pulled out a transparent overlay grid I'd brought from home, the same kind I used to use in the Corps when comparing topographic sheets. The discrepancy was surgical. The western boundary of my property, which on my father's survey ran along a natural ridgeline and a stone-walled creek bed, had been redrawn on the 2022 document to follow a straight line 1,200 feet to the east. No ridgeline, no creek reference, just a clean diagonal cut through the forest, perfectly positioned to carve out exactly 80 acres of my best hardwood timber. The new line didn't follow any natural feature. It didn't reference any monument, stake, or physical marker. It was drawn on a computer, in an office, by someone who wanted 80 acres and figured a quiet widower would never look close enough to notice. But I noticed, because I'd drawn 10,000 lines just like it, and I could tell the difference between a survey made in the field and one made behind a desk. My hands weren't shaking from anger. They were shaking from clarity, from the clean, cold understanding that everything, the tree cutting, the road, the fake citations, the harassment of my neighbors, had been planned, mapped out, budgeted. This wasn't Shelby Whitmore being a bully. This was a business plan, and my forest was the inventory. I photographed both documents side by side, measured the discrepancy with a scale ruler, and noted every reference point that had been altered or removed. Then, I carefully returned the 1978 plat to its envelope and thanked the archivist. In the parking lot, I sat in my truck and called Ray Combs. The autumn sun was low and orange through the windshield, and the courthouse clock tower cast a long shadow across the hood. "I've got both surveys," I said, "the 1978 original and the 2022 replacement. They moved the line 1,200 feet east. It's not an error, Ray. The new survey doesn't reference a single physical monument. They drew it on a screen and filed it." Ray was quiet for a moment. "Can you prove the 1978 survey matches the actual ground features?" "I walked that boundary with my father 100 times," I said. "The ridge is still there. The creek is still there. The stone wall is still there. Every monument on the original plat is still standing." "Then they didn't just make a mistake," Ray said. "They committed a crime. And every cabin they build on that land is another count." I hung up and sat there, watching the last of the sunlight slide off the courthouse bricks. 50 cabins, $30 million, built on a lie drawn with a computer mouse by people who thought no one would ever unfold the original map. They thought wrong. Over the next 6 weeks, I moved quietly and deliberately. Every step was planned. Every document was copied, notarized, and stored in 3 separate locations. I wasn't going to let one fire or one stolen briefcase unravel what I was building. The first call I made was to Phil Stanton, a licensed surveyor out of Toccoa who'd been in the business for 28 years and had no connection to anyone in Rabun County. I needed someone independent, someone whose testimony wouldn't be questioned. Phil drove out on a Saturday morning with his GPS equipment, a transit scope, and a rod man named Jerry, who looked like he'd been surveying since birth. They spent 2 full days in the field. Phil walked every monument on the 1978 plat: the ridgeline, the creek bed, the stone wall, the iron pipes my father had driven at each corner. Every single one matched the original survey within inches. Then, Phil plotted the actual boundary against the 2022 fraudulent survey. "Colton," he said, standing at the tailgate of his truck with the printout spread across it. "All 50 cabin sites are on your side of the line, not close to the line, not straddling it, fully on your property. Every foundation, every driveway, every utility hookup. I nodded. Can you certify that in a report suitable for court? I can certify it in my sleep, Phil said. With Phil's report in hand, I sat down with Ray Combs, and we mapped out the legal strategy. The centerpiece was the lis pendens, a Latin term that means notice of pending litigation. Here's how it works, and this is something every property owner in America should understand. When you file a lis pendens against a parcel of land, it creates a public record that there is a legal dispute over that property. The moment a lis pendens is recorded, it clouds the title. And a clouded title is like a stop sign for real estate transactions. No title insurance company will issue a policy on a property with an active lis pendens. No mortgage lender will fund a loan without title insurance. And without a funded loan, no buyer can close. In simple terms, one piece of paper filed at the county recorder's office can freeze a $30 million development in its tracks. Ray prepared 50 individual lis pendens filings, one for each cabin lot. Each filing referenced the original 1978 survey, Phil Stanton's independent certification, and the fraudulent 2022 document. Each one named Mountain Laurel Development LLC, Garrett Whitmore, and the HOA board as respondents. While Ray handled the paperwork, I filed a formal complaint with the Georgia Board of Professional Licensure against Dale Kessler, the surveyor who had signed the 2022 document. If his license was revoked, it would mean his survey had no legal standing, which would collapse the developer's entire chain of title. I also placed a call to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. A special agent named Draper took my information and told me they would open a preliminary inquiry into potential deed fraud. He didn't promise anything, but the fact that a state investigative agency was now aware of the situation added another layer of pressure that Garrett and Shelby didn't know existed. The final piece was timing. Ray and I spent an entire afternoon at his conference table with a calendar, a pot of burned coffee, and a county events page open on his laptop. We needed to know exactly when the closings would happen. By November, all 50 cabins were listed. By early December, all 50 had signed purchase agreements. The developer's office announced a grand closing weekend, scheduled for the second Saturday in January, a celebratory event at the model cabin where all 50 buyers would sign their paperwork, collect their keys, and toast to their new mountain retreat. That's our window, Ray said. We file the lis pendens on Thursday. Title companies get the notices Friday morning. By Saturday, not a single closing can go through. I looked at the calendar. January 11th, 2 months away. After everything, the stolen land, the fake surveys, the dead trees, the harassment, the lies. 2 months felt like nothing. Thursday it is, I said. By December, the Mountain Laurel Forest retreats looked like a postcard. All 50 cabins were finished. Cedar siding stained dark walnut, stone chimneys capped with copper, wraparound porches furnished with rocking chairs and wool blankets folded over the armrests. The model cabin had been staged by a professional decorator from Atlanta. Leather couches, antler chandeliers, a hand-hewn dining table that probably cost more than my truck. Shelby was at peak altitude. She posted photos on the HOA Facebook page almost daily. Drone shots of the cabins at sunrise, interior tours set to piano music, testimonials from buyers who couldn't wait to move in. One post read, "This is what happens when a community has vision. Mountain Laurel doesn't just build homes, we build legacies." Legacies. Built on stolen ground. With trees my father planted used as firewood for the staging photos. I kept my head down, took my walks, fed the birds Ellie used to feed, and waited. But Shelby had noticed something. Not the legal filings. Those were still weeks away. What she noticed was Phil Stanton's truck parked on the logging road near the south boundary. Someone in the neighborhood had seen a man with survey equipment walking my tree line and reported it to her. On a Wednesday afternoon in early December, I heard tires on gravel and looked up from the porch to see Shelby's white Escalade pulling into my driveway. She got out wearing a full-length camel coat and ankle boots that had no business being on a dirt road. Her perfume hit me before she reached the porch steps, something heavy and floral, like a department store had exploded. "Mr. Mercer," she said, standing at the bottom of the steps with her arms crossed. I hear you've been having someone poke around the property lines. I have the right to survey my own land, I said. I'm sure you do, but let me be very clear. She lowered her sunglasses and looked at me the way a cat looks at a mouse it's already caught. Whatever you're planning, it won't work. My husband has invested 2 years and millions of dollars into this development. The permits are filed, the surveys are recorded, the buyers are signed, and if you try to throw a wrench into this, you will lose. We own this process, Mr. Mercer. We own this town. I took a sip of coffee and didn't say a word. She waited for a response that didn't come. Then she turned, walked back to her Escalade, and drove away without closing the passenger side window, which meant her perfume lingered in the cold December air for a full 5 minutes after she was gone. 3 days later, I woke up at 2 in the morning to the smell of smoke. I pulled on boots and a jacket and ran to the south side of the property. My old equipment shed, the one where I stored my father's chainsaw collection, some survey tools, and 20 years of field notebooks, was burning. The flames were already through the roof by the time I got there, orange and roaring against the black sky. The heat hit me from 50 feet away, and I could hear the pop of aerosol cans inside like muffled gunshots. I called 911 and stood back. There was nothing to save. The Rabun County fire investigator ruled it arson 3 days later. An accelerant, likely gasoline, had been poured along the base of the north wall. The fire started at the far corner and spread in a pattern consistent with deliberate ignition. But here's what Shelby and Garrett didn't know. 2 weeks earlier, when Phil Stanton was doing his boundary survey, I'd mounted a trail camera on a fence post facing the shed. It was a motion-activated unit with infrared night vision, the kind deer hunters use. And at 1:47 a.m. on the night of the fire, that camera captured a clear image of a dark-colored Ford F350 with a dented rear bumper parked beside the shed. The same truck Garrett Whitmore drove to every HOA meeting. I downloaded the photos, backed them up to a flash drive, and added them to the file I was building. Then I called Ray Combs. They burned my shed, I said. Are you okay? I'm fine, and I've got the photos. Ray exhaled slowly. Add it to the pile. We file in 31 days. January was close enough to taste. The air in Rabun County had turned bitter cold, the kind that makes your knuckles ache and your breath hang in front of you like a thought you haven't finished. I could see the cabin development from my kitchen window now, warm yellow light glowing through the trees every evening as the staging crew ran the fireplaces for photo shoots. It looked peaceful from a distance, like a place Ellie and I might have visited once. The pressure started on New Year's Day. A man I'd never met showed up at my cabin in a charcoal suit and a rental car. His name was Lyle Burgess, and he said he represented Garrett Whitmore in a private capacity. He handed me a business card from a law firm in Atlanta and got straight to the point. Mr. Mercer, my client is aware that you've raised some concerns about the property boundaries near the Forest Retreats development. He wants you to know that he takes these matters seriously and would like to resolve this quietly. Lyle reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He's prepared to offer you $200,000 for a full release and waiver of any boundary claims. That's well above market value for the acreage in question. $200,000 for 80 acres of family land worth 10 times that, covered in $30 million worth of cabins. No, I said. Lyle blinked. Mr. Mercer, I'd encourage you to think about this carefully. This offer is generous, and once the closings are finalized, your leverage diminishes significantly. Mr. Whitmore is trying to be reasonable. He's trying to buy silence, I said. There's a difference, and you can tell him my answer is no. Lyle left, and I didn't hear from him again. But Shelby picked up where he left off. Within a week, she launched a campaign that would have been impressive if it weren't so desperate. She told everyone in the subdivision that I was mentally unstable, a reclusive widower who had delusions about property boundaries and was harassing the development team. She organized a petition among Mountain Laurel homeowners, demanding that the county investigate me for threatening behavior. 43 people signed it. Most of them had never spoken to me in their lives. On January 4th, she filed for a temporary restraining order against me, claiming I had made intimidating statements during her visit to my property. The motion was heard by Judge Patricia Embry at the Rabun County Superior Court. Shelby testified for 20 minutes. When it was my turn, Ray Combs stood up and submitted the trail camera photos of the F350 at my burning shed, the county inspector's report finding 0 violations on my property, and a timeline of every false complaint Shelby had filed against me and my neighbors over the past 3 years. Judge Embry denied the restraining order in under 4 minutes, but the moment that sealed everything came 2 days later. Hank Pryor called me on a Tuesday evening. Hank had run into Lyle Burgess at the gas station in Clayton, and Lyle, apparently not the most discreet attorney in Georgia, had said something he shouldn't have. "Colton," Hank said, "that lawyer told me, and I'm quoting here, Garrett said Mercer would eventually figure out the survey didn't match. That's why the $200,000 is on the table. It's more than fair for that kind of scrubland." I made Hank repeat it. Then I wrote it down, word for word, and had him sign a dated statement the next morning. Garrett knew. He knew the survey was fraudulent. He knew the land was mine, and he tried to buy me off before I could prove it. That single sentence, repeated by his own attorney to a witness, was an admission of knowledge. In a fraud case, proving the defendant knew the document was false is the hardest part. Lyle Burgess had just handed it to me at a Shell station for the price of a tank of premium. I called Ray that night. "We've got the admission," I said. "File date is Thursday, January 9th, Ray said. "Don't change a thing. Don't talk to anyone. Just breathe." I sat on the porch that night for a long time. The temperature was in the 20s, and the stars were so bright they looked close enough to touch. Through the bare branches of the winter oaks, I could see the cabin lights flickering like a little counterfeit village. 2 more days. Thursday, January 9th, 8:14 a.m. The Rabun County Recorder's Office had been open for exactly 14 minutes when Ray Combs and I walked through the front door, carrying 2 banker's boxes. Each box contained 25 individually prepared lease pendants filings, one for every cabin lot in the Mountain Laurel Forest retreats. Paige was behind the counter again. She looked at the boxes, then at me, then at Ray. "All 50?" she asked. "All 50, Ray said. It took 90 minutes to process and record every filing. Each one was stamped, assigned a document number, and entered into the county's official records system. By 9:45, every lot in the development had a lis pendens attached to its title, like an anchor dropped from a helicopter. We walked out into the parking lot, and I leaned against my truck. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of January day where the sky is so blue it looks fake. Ray was already on his phone. "Now we wait," he said. "The title companies will see these by tomorrow morning. After that, the phones start ringing." Friday morning, the phones rang. First, it was the escrow company handling the closings. Then the title insurance underwriter. Then 3 different mortgage lenders, all calling the developer's office demanding explanations. By noon, every title company involved in the grand closing weekend had issued the same statement. Closings suspended pending resolution of title disputes. 50 closings, $30 million. Frozen. Saturday, January 11th, the grand closing event. I drove to the model cabin at 10 a.m. The parking lot was already full. 50 families had traveled from across the southeast to close on their mountain retreats. Some had driven from Florida with U-Hauls attached. Others had flown into Atlanta and rented SUVs. Children ran between the parked cars. A catering company was setting up champagne flutes on a table draped in white linen near the front porch. Garrett Whitmore stood at a podium inside the model cabin's great room, wearing a navy suit and a confident smile. Shelby sat in the front row in a burgundy dress and freshly highlighted hair, looking like a woman who expected applause. Behind them, a projection screen showed the Mountain Laurel logo and the words, "Welcome home." At 10:15, a woman from the title company stepped forward and whispered something in Garrett's ear. His smile dissolved like sugar in hot water. He whispered back. She shook her head. He whispered again, more urgently. She shook her head again. Then Garrett stepped to the microphone and said, "Folks, we're going to need just a few minutes. There's been a small administrative issue with some of the paperwork." A small administrative issue. That's what he called 50 lease pendants filings, a fraudulent survey, and a state investigation. 10 minutes later, I walked through the front door with Phil Stanton, Ray Combs, Tessa Langley from the Rabun County Herald, and Deputy Wade Thornton. The room went quiet. Ray stepped forward and addressed the crowd. "My name is Ray Combs. I represent the owner of the land this development is built on, Mr. Colton Mercer. Yesterday, we filed lis pendens notices on all 50 lots in this development, because every cabin you see was constructed on property that belongs to Mr. Mercer's family and has since 1978. He clicked a remote and the projector switched from the Mountain Laurel logo to a side-by-side comparison of the 1978 survey and the 2022 fraudulent filing. The boundary shift was visible to anyone with eyes. The survey used to justify this development, Ray continued, was filed fraudulently. The property line was moved 1,200 feet to steal 80 acres of Mr. Mercer's forest. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation has been notified, and a formal complaint has been filed with the state licensing board." Silence. Then murmurs. Then somebody in the back said, "We drove from Tampa for this?" I stepped forward. I wasn't nervous. I'd been waiting for this moment for 9 months. "My father bought this land in 1978, I said, looking at the crowd. "Every tree you can see from these windows, every ridge, every creek, it's been in my family for nearly 50 years. The developer built these cabins on my property without my knowledge, using a fake survey and an HOA board that looked the other way because the president's husband was the one writing the checks." I paused. "Under Georgia law, permanent improvements built on another person's property without consent belong to the property owner. That means every cabin you're sitting in right now is mine." Garrett lunged for the microphone. "This is a lie. This man is a fraud. He's been harassing this development for—" Deputy Thornton stepped between us. "Mr. Whitmore, you need to step back." At that moment, 2 agents from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation walked through the side door. One of them was Special Agent Draper. "Garrett Whitmore," Draper said, "you're under arrest for filing fraudulent documents with the Rabun County Recorder's Office and conspiracy to commit deed fraud." Shelby stood up so fast her chair fell backward. "You can't do this. We have permits. We have approvals." "Ma'am," Deputy Thornton said, "you have the right to remain silent. I'd strongly suggest you use it." Tessa Langley's camera shutter clicked 17 times in 30 seconds. The fallout was swift and thorough. Garrett Whitmore was indicted on 4 counts